Well, good morning, everyone. Welcome back to Morning Musings. My name is Don K. Preston. I'm the president of Preterist Research Institute of Ardmore, Oklahoma. Okay, sorry about no video yesterday. Had a lot of things going, too much going. So I just decided to skip and not do filming for Monday. Sorry about that. I do apologize. So here I am trying to get a little bit caught up and what have you. Now then, we have been going through in a very cursory manner, the Song of Moses. Now, the reason I've been doing that in our study of the Olivet Discourse is for the following reason. Matthew chapter 25, 31 and following is set in the last days and the day of the Lord when all the nations of the earth would be gathered. Okay? That prophecy is found in the Old Testament in Joel chapter 2 and chapter 3, which predicted the last days, the great and terrible day of the Lord, when all the nations would be gathered together. Now there's another issue in Joel chapter 2 and 3. In Joel 3 and verse 21, in those days and at that time, the Lord would acquit the blood guilt of Jerusalem. Now, the way God would acquit that blood guilt is by bringing judgment and wrath on those guilty of shedding innocent blood and sparing the righteous remnant, as I've shared on many, many occasions. So we have Matthew chapter 25, 31 and following. Last days, day of the Lord. Now, let me point something out. I really shouldn't by this time. I shouldn't have to, but I understand and I know that the verbiage, the linguistics of the avenging of the blood is not found in Matthew chapter 25, 31 and following. That doesn't mean that it's not about the time of the avenging of the blood. I have shared with you on many, many occasions how false it is to take passage A, passage B. Passage A gives the following constituent elements: 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Passage B contains the following constituent elements that are identical to passage A, 1, 2, 3. It omits 4 and 5. Does that mean that we are to conclude that passage B is not on the same subject about the same time frame as passage A? No. That's an illegitimate hermeneutic, ladies and gentlemen. And yet, by the way, Steve Gregg, in his 2022 book, Why Not Full Preterism, on the one hand, he kind of condemns that practice of saying, well, passage A has 5 constituent elements. Passage B seems to be talking about the same thing. For instance, it's the day of the Lord. It's even the resurrection. It's the coming of the Lord with a shout, etc. But passage B leaves out 2 or 3 constituent elements from passage A. Now, Steve Gregg says you can't do that. That's not a proper hermeneutic. But guess what he does throughout the entirety of his book? He argues that, well, Matthew chapter 24 cannot be identical to, parallel to, 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, because 1 Thessalonians chapter 4 discusses the rapture and the resurrection, and Matthew chapter 24 verses 4 to 34, does not mention the rapture and the resurrection. So on the one hand, Steve Gregg says, oh, it's an illegitimate hermeneutic to argue that because passage B leaves out some constituent elements that demands that it's different from passage A. He says that's illegitimate. And yet he argues that because Matthew chapter 24, 4 to 34 does not mention explicitly and expressly, emphatically, rapture and resurrection that it cannot be dealing with 1 Thessalonians chapter 4. Ladies and gentlemen, that's double talk. And I mean no offense to Steve. He's a great guy, very congenial, very cordial. But that's totally inconsistent. So, I understand that Matthew chapter 25, 31 and following does not mention the avenging of the blood. That doesn't mean that it's not set in that particular context, however. And that's really, really important to keep in mind. With that hermeneutic examination in front of us, once again, we have Matthew 25, 31 and following, said in the last days, the day of the Lord, and I affirm, the avenging of the blood. Just like Isaiah chapters 2 through 4 talks about the last days, the day of the Lord, the avenging of the blood. And then we have Deuteronomy chapter 32, which is about Israel's last days. Deuteronomy 32, 19 through 21. Deuteronomy 32, 29 to 31. And this is kind of where we left off last week. We have the avenging of the blood of the martyrs. Now, what's absolutely fascinating about this, and I have to spend just a moment on it, rejoice, O ye Gentiles, with his people. So the Gentiles in Israel's last days would rejoice with Israel. Why would they rejoice? Oh, for a lot of reasons. But number one being that God, due to Israel's rebellion, was going to call a nation that had never known him, a nation that had never called on his name. He would call them to himself so that they could be his people. So in Israel's last days, the Gentiles would join with Israel, i.e. God's people, and rejoice because they also had become God's people. Isn't that beautiful? So, rejoice, O Gentiles, with his people, for God has avenged the blood of his saints. Now, look, ladies and gentlemen, you have heard me say this before. I will undoubtedly say this more. The doctrine of the avenging of the blood of the martyrs is in reality one of the most ignored eschatological topics in all of the Bible. The promise of the avenging of the blood of the martyrs begins with Abel and goes to Revelation. And I've mentioned a book. You have to excuse me and you forgive me. I just, for the laugh of me, I couldn't remember the name of it. But I've mentioned a book to you by my good friend Samuel Dawson. Well, the book is entitled, as you can see there, Revelation Realized, Martyr Vindication from Genesis to Revelation. As you can also see, this is a very big book. But I want to tell you, he does as good a job as anyone that I have seen in developing the story of the vindication of the martyrs. There is a constant bloody red thread that runs from Genesis through Revelation. There is the promise that in Israel's last days, all of the blood of all of the righteous, all the way from Abel unto Zacharias, son of Berechiah, whom you slew between the temple and the altar, Matthew chapter 23, 29 and following, all of that blood would be avenged in Jesus's generation. So what do we have? We have the promise of Israel's last days. Oh, and by the way, we have the promise of the coming of the Lord, the time of the judgment of Israel, Deuteronomy 32:35. The Lord will judge his people. It is a fearful thing to fall into the hands of the living God. And the promise of the avenging of the blood of the martyrs. So here's where we're at. We'll pick it up the rest of the week. If it is the case that Matthew chapter 25, 31 and following, 25, 31 and following, if it is the case, that is the same last days and the same day of the Lord as foretold in Joel, as foretold in Isaiah, then it is the same last days and the same day of judgment for the avenging of the blood of the martyrs as foretold in Deuteronomy chapter 32. And here's what that means. Since Deuteronomy chapter 32 has nothing to do with the end of time, nothing whatsoever to do with the end of the Christian age, nothing whatsoever to do with the Messianic age, using those terms interchangeably, then Matthew 25:31 and following, being about the fulfillment of Deuteronomy 32, that means that Matthew chapter 25:31 and following was about the time of the vindication of the martyrs that took place in AD 70. Listen, do yourself a huge favor. Go to my website, donkpreston.com, bibleprophecy.com. There you go, not so much glare. And there on the very opening page, right up at the very top, there's a beautiful banner produced by my friend and webmaster, Alan Morton. Do yourself a favor, order the book, $21.95. If you send me a note that says you saw the offer on YouTube or Facebook, I'll refund your shipping of $4.95. That will save you $5. Okay? Do yourself a favor. Get this book. In the meantime, I'll see you on the flip side.